address option on there?
Test, test, test. 1, 2, 3.
All right.
Test.
We're all set? All right. I'm going to start this public hearing. This is a public hearing regarding the proposed Chicago landmark designation of the Century Building at 202 South State Street and the Consumer Building at 220 South State Street. Today's date is Monday, November 13th at 9 a.m. Docket number 2023-09 and 2023-10. So, good morning. I'd like to call this public hearing to order. My name is Ernest Wong. I'm the chair of the Commission on Chicago Landmarks, and I'll be the hearing officer for today's hearing. With me today are Suzanne Halal, Assistant Corporate Counsel of the Real Estate and Land Use Division of the city's Law Department, who is the Commission's counsel for today's public hearing, and Deanna Cavallo, head of the Historic Preservation Division of the Department of Planning and Development. I'll briefly summarize the nature of today's hearing. The Commission on Chicago Landmarks was established and is governed by the Municipal Code of Chicago. The procedures for today's public hearing are contained in Article 2 of the Commission's Rules and Regulations governing hearings on landmark designations. The purposes and duties of the Commission are set forth in the Municipal Code and include the identification, preservation, protection, enhancement, and encouragement of the continued use and rehabilitation of buildings and districts having special historical, community, architectural, or aesthetic interest to the City of Chicago and its citizens. The Commission carries out this mandate by recommending to the City Council the designation of specific buildings, structures, areas, districts, and works of art as official Chicago landmarks. The Commission bases its recommendations on the 7 criteria set forth in Section 2-120-620 of the Municipal Code and the integrity criterion set forth in Section 2-120-630 of the Municipal Code. The purpose of today's hearing is for the Commission to receive relevant facts and information to assist the Commission in deciding whether to recommend that the Century Building at 202 South State Street and the Consumer Building at 220 South State Street meet the criteria set forth in Section 2-120-620. The Century Building is being considered for individual landmark status, as is the Consumers Building. Nevertheless, in the interest of using everyone's time most efficiently and given the buildings, plural, proximity to each other, their ownership by the same entity, and the facts shared by both buildings relative to the Commission's consideration of their designation, I've decided to receive relevant documents and exhibits and to hear testimony for both buildings at one hearing rather than hold 2 separate public hearings. To do this, I will first consider documents, exhibits, and testimony regarding the Century Building. Once that is concluded, I'll do the same for the Consumer Building. Certain documents, exhibits, or testimony may apply to both buildings, and this can be considered as appropriate in order to make the best use of everyone's time today. If necessary, I may call for a break at some point during today's hearing. If I do this, I'll announce the time and location where the hearing will reconvene. However, ideally, we'll be able to conclude the hearing before noon, as we would like to move to another location, as we would need to move to another location if it were to continue into the afternoon. So let's start today's hearing with consideration of documents, exhibits, and testimony regarding the Century Building at 202 South State Street. We'll begin with the chronology of events leading to this public hearing and incorporate the Commission's exhibits into the record. I'd like to call on Deanna Cavallo to read the chronology of events leading to today's hearing. Deanna?
Thank you, Chairman Wong. Good morning. The 2022 Federal Consolidated Appropriations Act was approved on March 15, 2022, and contained funding of $52 million for the demolition of the buildings located at 202 to 220 South State Street in Chicago, Illinois, and protection of the adjacent buildings during the demolition process, securing the vacant site of the demolished buildings, and landscaping the vacant site following the demolition. At the request of Chairman Ernest Wong of the Commission on Chicago Landmarks, the Commission, Chicago Department of Planning and Development, DPD, Historic Preservation Division staff, gave an informational presentation on the history and recent developments regarding the Century Building at 202 South State Street and the Consumers Building at 220 South State Street at the July 7, 2022 regular monthly meeting of the Commission on Chicago Landmarks. A printout of the presentation is identified as Commission Document 1. The General Services Administration, the GSA, which is the federal agency with ownership of the Century and Consumers buildings, and a representative for the judges who work in the adjacent Dirksen building, Chief District Judge Rebecca Pallmeyer, provided written statements which were read into the record at the meeting. These statements are labeled Commission Document 2. Written statements submitted by the public to the Commission are included as Commission Document 3. The Commission voted to approve a resolution directing Historic Preservation Division staff to prepare a preliminary summary of information for each of the structures and to present their findings to the Commission. The signed resolution is included as Commission Document 4. At the Commission's September 8, 2022 regular monthly meeting, Chairman Wong stated that he would not be calling for a vote on the preliminary landmark designation of the Century and Consumers buildings, as he felt the Commission needed far more specificity regarding the perceived safety issues to be able to initiate a designation process that helped the buildings to be rehabilitated in a way which provided reasonable and necessary security for the courthouse to the west. He asked staff to work with relevant city and federal agencies to identify specific safety issues as the federal Section 106 process, prompted by the proposed demolition of 202 to 220 South State Street, moved forward later in the year. He then asked Historic Preservation staff to present their findings. The staff presentation is printed out and included as Commission Document 5. Written statements were received from GSA and Chief Judge Rebecca Pallmeyer and were read into the record. These are labeled Commission Document 6. Written statements submitted by the public are included as Commission Document 7. At the April 13, 2023 Commission meeting, Chairman Wong said he was satisfied it was time to move forward with the Commission's consideration of preliminary landmark recommendations for the Century and Consumers buildings. He asked Historic Preservation Division staff to present an update on the Century and Consumers buildings. That presentation is included as Commission Document 8. He then read into the record written statements from the GSA and Chief Judge Rebecca Pallmeyer, which are marked as Commission Document 9. He asked Historic Preservation Division staff to provide a presentation on the Century building, and a printout of this is marked as Commission Document 10. The Commission found that the Century building appeared to meet 3 of the 7 criteria for designation, as well as the integrity criterion identified in the Chicago Landmarks Ordinance, Municipal Code of the City of Chicago, Section 2-12580, and approved a preliminary recommendation for Chicago landmark designation of the Century building identified as Commission Document 11. This recommendation initiated the consideration process for further study and analysis of the possible landmark designation of the building. As part of the preliminary recommendation, the Commission preliminarily identified the significant historical and architectural features of the Century building as all exterior elevations of the building, including roof lines and the first and second floor exteriors remodeled in 1951 to 1952, and in light of the Century building's adjacency to the Dirksen U.S. Courthouse and the security vulnerabilities asserted by the federal government, and in order to recognize and provide the flexibility which may be needed to accommodate the 15 reuse criteria provided by the General Services Administration for the Century building, which were developed in collaboration with the United States District Court, Northern District of Illinois, and federal law enforcement agencies, and published in the November 1st, 2022 Federal Register. The following additional guidelines should also apply to the Commission's review of permits pursuant to Section 212740. The Commission shall have flexibility to allow modifications to the Century Building to accommodate the GSA's reuse criteria in order that viable reuse of the building can be achieved. As part of the preliminary recommendation, the Commission adopted a preliminary summary of information dated April 2023 and identified as Commission Document 12. Historic Preservation Division staff then made a presentation on the Consumers Building, a printout of which is Commission Document 13. The Commission found that the Consumers Building appeared to meet 3 of the 7 criteria for designation, as well as in the integrity criterion identified in the Chicago Landmarks Ordinance, and approved a preliminary recommendation for Chicago Landmark designation of the Consumers Building, identified as Commission Document 14. As part of the preliminary recommendation, the Commission preliminarily identified the significant historical and architectural features of the Consumers Building as all exterior elevations, including roof lines of the building, and the main entrance, vestibule, and elevator lobby. The lobby staircase to the second floor and the barrel vaulted staircase to the basement, including marble finishes at walls and ceilings, are included. And in light of the Consumers Building's adjacency to the Dirksen U.S. Courthouse, and in order to recognize and provide the flexibility which may be needed to accommodate the 15 reuse criteria provided by the General Services Administration for the Consumers Building, which were developed in collaboration with United States District Court, Northern District of Illinois, and federal law enforcement agencies, and published in the November 1st, 2022 Federal Register. The following additional guidelines shall also apply to the Commission's review of permits pursuant to Section 212740. The Commission shall have flexibility to allow modifications to the Consumers Building to accommodate the GSA's reuse criteria in order that viable reuse of the building can be achieved. Commission Document 15 is the accompanying preliminary summary of information for the Consumers Building dated April 2023. Written statements submitted by the public regarding landmark designation of the Century and Consumers Buildings are grouped as Commission Document 16. Historic Preservation Division staff notified the GSA of the preliminary recommendations for the Century and Consumers Buildings via certified mail with letters dated April 21, 2023. The letter for the Century Building is identified as Commission Document 17. The letter for the Consumers Building is identified as Commission Document 18, and proof of the certified mailings is included as Commission Document 19. At its regular meeting of May 4, 2023, the Commission received a report identified as Commission Document 20 from Maurice Cox, then DPD Commissioner, stating that the proposed landmark designation of the Century and Consumers Buildings supports the city's overall planning goals for the surrounding Loop community area and the central planning region, and is consistent with the city's governing policies and plans. In letters dated May 10, 23, the Commission officially requested consent to the proposed landmark designations from GSA. A copy of the letter for the Century Building, which requested the return of an enclosed written consent form indicating consent or non-consent by June 26, 2023, is identified as Commission Document 21, and the version for the Consumers Building is included as Commission Document 22. The letters also notified the owner that they could request 120-day extensions to respond to the Commission's requests. In an email dated June 12, 2023, GSA requested a 120-day extension to respond regarding consent for the Century and the Consumers Buildings, and an email reply granted that extension through October 23, 23. Both are included as Commission Document 23. Commission Document 24 is an email from GSA indicating that they would not be providing consent for the landmark designation of the Century and Consumers Buildings. without written consent from the owner of the properties. Section 2-120-650 of the Chicago Landmarks Ordinance requires the commission hold a public hearing on the preliminary recommendations with respect to the designation of the Century and Consumers Buildings as Chicago landmarks. In letters dated October 25th, 2023, the commission notified GSA of the public hearing to be held today, November 13, 23. The letter for the Century Building is Commission Document 25, and the letter for the Consumers Building is Commission Document 26. Notices for the hearing were published in the Chicago Tribune on October 26, 23. A certificate from the Chicago Tribune attesting to the publication of the notice for the Century Building is Commission Document 27. The certificate for the Consumers Building is Commission Document 28. Signs noticing the hearing for the Century Building were posted in the public right-of-way at the Adams and State Street elevations of the building on October 30th, 23, and photos are included as Commission Document 29 with a copy of the notice. Signs noticing the hearing for the Consumers Building were posted in the public right-of-way in front of the building on October 30th, 23, and photos were included as Commission Document 30 with a copy of the notice. The public hearing notice was also posted on the Department of Planning and Development's notice board and website, and a printout of the website is included as Commission Document 31.
Thank you, Deanna. I'd like to incorporate these documents of the commission into the record. The commission's documents may be examined at this hearing and are also available for inspection at the commission's office. Next, I'll rule on the request for party status. All property owners or their representatives have the right to make a statement for or against the proposed designation. They also have the right to ask questions of the commission staff after staff has completed their presentation. The Landmarks Ordinance also allows property owners and other individuals and organizations to request status as a party to the hearing. Parties to the hearings proceedings can make longer and more detailed presentations for or against a proposed landmark designation that can include submitting photographs and other documents, as well as presenting testimony from their own witnesses. Parties may also question any other party's witnesses and question the commission staff member who summarized the preliminary landmark recommendation. Only those who want to make a more detailed presentation beyond a statement or question need to request party status. Those wishing to request party status should fill out a blue appearance form and return it to the member's staff. These forms are at the table by the door. If you wish to be a party and you filled out a blue appearance form requesting party status, I'll call on each of you in turn and consider your party status request. If you have not filled out a blue appearance form but wish to be a party, please do so now. Please note, however, that party status is not required if a property owner or other individual or organization only wishes to make a statement for or against the proposed designation. Everyone will have an opportunity to make a statement during the public statement portion of the hearing. In addition, property owners have the right to question commission staff and experts, regardless of whether they are parties to the proceedings. If you wish to make statements in support of the proposed landmark designation, you should fill out a pink appearance form. If you wish to make statements in opposition to the proposed landmark designation, you should fill out an orange appearance form. These forms are at the table by the door and should be completed and returned to a member of the staff at this time. Please include your name and address or the name and address of the organization you represent. I have no blue appearance forms requesting party status. So we'll now hear a presentation by Matt Crawford of the commission staff summarizing the preliminary landmark recommendation for the Century Building. Matt?
Thank you, Chairman Wong. Okay, so the Century Building was built between 1915 and 1916 and designed by the architectural firm of Halliburton and Roche. It's located at 202 South State Street at the southwest corner of Adams and State. Based on an evaluation of the property, the Commission has preliminarily found that the Century Building meets 3 criteria for Chicago landmark designation, including criterion 1 for heritage. Beginning with Potter Palmer's purchase of improvements of 3/4 of a mile of State Street in 1867, retail in Chicago has been centered along this thoroughfare. As the city's population grew exponentially in the following decades and the city expanded outward through annexation, centralization of rapid transit guaranteed the business and retail dominance of the city's historic center, particularly on State. The 1898 map at left shows the loop elevated tracks encircling the central business district, which was used by multiple elevated lines branching out to different parts of the city. Demand for space in the loop exerted pressure on real estate values, which in turn encouraged maximization of return on square footage of land, leading to the construction of ever taller buildings. Small-scale commercial buildings disappeared as investors saw opportunity to build large-scale speculative commercial buildings in their place, eventually giving rise to the skyscraper. The Century Building is an outstanding example of a type of multi-tenant skyscraper known as a tall shops building. Tall shops buildings were speculative high-rise structures that were designed to serve retailers by creating interior shopping streets. Handsome edifices with lavish entries and lobbies were designed to attract and encourage potential customers to enter and circulate through the interior. Elegant display cases outside and inside the ground floor allowed upper floor tenants to advertise their wares. The rendering on the left is from a brochure promoting the Century Building, and it showcases the marble cladding and intricate bronze fixtures of the lobby. On upper floors, glass corridor walls of the tenant spaces function like shop windows, as seen in this Halliburton Roche drawing at upper right of a typical interior corridor. The Century Building was built as a commercial investment property by the Buck and Rayner Drug Manufacturing Company. The company also already had 2 corner drugstores on State, one at Madison and one at Randolph. The corner ground floor space at 202 South State Street gave them their third at Adams. High-rise tall shops and the more ubiquitous professional office buildings typically occupied compact corner lots on State. These tall, narrow skyscrapers contributed to the increasing density of State Street over the course of its evolution as Chicago's primary retail corridor. The Commission also found that the building meets criterion 5 as the work of a significant architectural practice. In this case, the architects were William Halliburton and Martin Roche, both of whom are recognized as innovative practitioners of the Chicago School of Architecture. The Halliburton Roche firm was one of the most successful and productive architectural firms of Chicago between 1883 and 1927. By the time of the Century Building Commission, when the Century Building was completed in 1916, the firm was responsible for 5 to 10% of the building construction in Chicago. Halliburton Roche is one of the most responsible for shaping the look of State Street architecturally around the turn of the 20th century. The Century Building was one in a series of their steel frame, white glazed terracotta buildings, which they became known for. including the now demolished Republic Building, formerly at 209 South State, and the extant North American Building from 1912 at 36 South State, the Rothschild Department Store at 333 South State, and the Waterman Building at 127 South State Street. Over a dozen of their buildings are designated as individual Chicago landmarks, including the Old Colony, Marquette, Chicago, this building in which we sit, and the Three Arts Club and the Palmer House Hotel. The commission also found preliminarily that the Century Building meets criterion 4 as exemplary architecture. The Century Building is a commercial style building, and fundamental components of the Chicago commercial style became part of what is known as the Chicago School of Architecture. Underlining the school were advancements in construction methods and materials which allowed buildings to grow taller, exterior walls to open up to allow more light, and usable interior space to be maximized with fewer internal columns. At 16 stories, the Century Building was considered relatively tall for its time. Its steel frame allowed for large window openings. The frame also provided the building's structural support such that terracotta could be hung from the columns and horizontal beams to create a grid across the primary facades. Century Building displays a high level of detailing and craftsmanship in late Gothic terracotta ornamentation on the building's exterior. The building was one of dozens of loop structures built in 2 decades leading up to World War I, featuring white glazed terracotta cladding. Taken together, they represented the most extensive use of white glazed terracotta in the city. Permits were issued for storefront changes at the building in 1934 and again in 1944. The wholesale change of storefronts, indeed entire facades, has been a continuous phenomenon from State Street's earliest days. With the recovery of the economy after World War II, modernization of commercial spaces accelerated on State. Home Federal Savings Company purchased the building in 1948, and non-original storefronts were replaced with a continuous storefront of regularly placed, narrow floor-to-ceiling mullions, securing large plate glass windows trimmed in brushed stainless steel. At the State Street elevation, glass panels curve to form an S shape, arching out to align with the front plane of the building's midpoint, intersecting with smooth granite-clad angled entries at the corners. At the second floor, window openings were reconfigured to centered bands of fixed windows divided by stainless steel mullions. The storefront of the Century Building is an excellent example of the translation of the international style to storefront design. New open front storefronts prioritized views inside the building such that internal commercial spaces became the display. The 1951 to 1952 remodeling of the Century Building's first 2 floors is still intact today, reflects the optimism and prosperity of post-war America, when new was equated with better. Like other financial institutions of the city of the era, appearing modern and more efficient was seen as a way to attract customers. The unadorned, smooth lines of the international style were used to communicate this message. In addition to these 3 criteria, the Commission preliminarily found that the building meets the integrity criterion. Viewing the first and second floor exterior alterations as significant in their own right, overall the Century Building maintains substantial integrity. Absence of the original cornice, as seen in these comparison photos, is not unusual for buildings of this vintage, and this does not significantly impair the building's ability to convey its historic value. As previously noted, the terracotta exterior is in need of substantial repair and replacement, but enough remains intact to provide the essential visual character of the historic building. No major additions or alterations have been made to the building since 1952, leaving most historic features and finishes in overall form, footprint, location of entrances, and arrangement of the windows intact. The 1952 storefront is remarkably intact. Windows and some portions of the granite cladding at the north and east elevations of the second floor have been removed, but the reconfigured openings remain. There is photographic documentation of the remodeling and original cladding at the first floor that could be used to inform future restoration. So these losses can be considered reversible. The projecting steel canopy over the sidewalk is installed above the first floor, is temporary and easily reversed. The Commission's finding of what is the significant historical and architectural features have been identified as all exterior elevations of the building, including its roof lines, as well as the first and second floor exteriors remodeled in 1952. In light of the building's adjacency to the U.S. courthouse and the security vulnerabilities asserted by the federal government, and in order to recognize and provide the flexibility which may be needed to accommodate the 15 reuse criteria provided by the General Services Administration, or GSA, for the Century Building, which were developed in collaboration with the United States District Court of the Northern District of Illinois and federal law enforcement agencies, and published in the November 1st, 2022 Federal Register, the following additional guidelines shall also apply to the Commission's review of permits. The building shall have flexibility to allow modifications to the Century Building to accommodate the GSA's reuse criteria in order that viable reuse of the building can be achieved. The building is located in the 34th Ward, and Alderman William Conway is aware of this preliminary landmark recommendation, and he is also aware of today's hearing. This concludes staff's presentation for the Century Building. Happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Matt. That concludes the staff's presentation. Matt Crawford, staff's the Commission on Chicago Landmarks and is here to take questions. Questions must relate to whether the proposed designation meets the criteria for landmark designation. And these questions can be brought forth by either the property owner or somebody who has signed up as a party to this this case. Nobody has signed up as parties. So we will go to statements by property owners and members of the general public regarding the proposed landmark designation. Statements may be made in favor or in opposition to the proposed landmark designation. Anyone wishing to make a statement in favor of the proposed designation should have filled out a pink appearance form. Those who wish to speak in opposition to the proposed designation should have filled out an orange appearance form. If you haven't already completed a form, they're available from the staff. Statements from the property owners are limited to 5 minutes, while members of the general public are limited to 3 minutes or less. Please state your name and address and the person or organization you represent, if applicable. In the interest of time, you're encouraged to focus your statements on information not previously given. I also will encourage you, if you have signed up for both of these properties, the Century Building at 202 South State and the Consumer Buildings at 220 South State, you can make your statements in reference to both of those properties at the same time, as opposed to doing them separately. Instead of an oral statement, you may submit a written statement. If you wish to submit a written statement, please include your name and address and the person or organization you represent, if applicable, at the top of your statement, and give it to a member of the staff. Before I call on people to speak, prior to this hearing, Historic Preservation Division staff received a letter from the United States General Services Administration, the owner of the Century and Consumer Buildings, and they have requested that this letter be read into the record, so I'd like to do that at this time. And this is dated October 23rd and addressed to Deanna Cavallo, the Director of the Landmarks Division, City of Chicago Department of Planning and Development. Dear Deanna, on June 12th, 2023, I emailed you to request a 120-day extension to your office's request for GSA's consent for a local landmark status for the properties the agency owns located at 202 South State Street, the Century Building, and 220 South State Street, the Consumer Building. That extension is due to expire tomorrow, and GSA recognizes that without our consent for local landmark status, the Chicago Landmark Ordinance requires the Landmark Division of the City of Chicago to proceed to a public hearing process for local landmark nomination. You and your staff, as well as others within the city's Department of Planning and Development, have been participating in GSA's National Historic Preservation Act, NHPA, Section 106, consultation process in response to the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022, which included $52 million for the demolition of the structures located from 202 South State Street to 220 South State Street. The loss of historic properties located at these parcels would result in adverse effects on those properties and others within the area of potential effects, otherwise known as APE, which GSA has identified in the course of consultation. The Section 106 regulations require federal agencies to seek to resolve adverse effects prior to the agency's establishment of a record of decision on the actions it will take. We will continue to adhere to the federal regulatory process. As you know, there are 4 basic steps involved in the Section 106 process. GSA is completing step number 3, assessment of effects on historic properties, and embarking on step 4, resolving adverse effects to historic properties. Until GSA identifies how we can resolve adverse effects, we believe it is premature for us to provide consent for local landmarking. We are working together with our federal partners, Section 106 consulting parties, including the city and external consultants, to determine how to balance our need to meet security requirements for the adjacent U.S. courthouse with a viable reuse strategy for the historic properties at 202 through 220 South State Street. Our project schedule is targeting early spring of 2024 to complete a programmatic agreement that will guide how the alternatives under consideration will resolve adverse effects to historic properties. Until the Section 106 process is complete, we believe it is premature for the GSA to provide consent for local landmark status. However, we understand the constraints involved with the City of Chicago's landmark ordinance and the next steps your office is required to take in the absence of GSA's consent. We ask that you please keep us appraised as you move forward with your processes. Sincerely, Regina Nally, Historic Preservation Officer, GSA, Great Lakes Region. And copied on this is Joseph Mulligan, GSA Project Manager, and Beth Savage, GSA Federal Preservation Officer. Okay. So we will hear statements in favor of the proposed landmark designation, of which there are several. And again, I'm going to ask you if you would like to speak on both properties at the same time. That would be great. So I'm going to go from this. And we're going to start this off. Lead off batter is Ward Miller.
Thank you. What's your walk-on soundboard?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and I'm Ward Miller. I'm the Richard H. Treehouse Executive Director of Preservation Chicago. I'm combining our testimonies for both the Century and Consumers buildings this morning. And we at Preservation Chicago fully support the Chicago Landmark recommendation, the report from the Department of Planning and Development, and the Chicago Landmark designation of the Century and Consumers buildings located at 202 and 220 South State Street in the heart of downtown Chicago. These two structures are a seminal part of the early Chicago skyscrapers and a system of construction which allowed for the buildings to reach new heights due to the introduction of a steel framing system. The construction system developed in Chicago is still employed in buildings around the world today, more than a century later. The Century and Consumers buildings were truly part of this story and Chicago's first golden age of architecture and design. The Century and Consumers buildings of 1913 and 1915 also marked a transition period, as they were the last of the tall buildings attributed to this period in style prior to World War I, and known as the Chicago School of Architecture or the Chicago Commercial Style. The Century building is attributed to the firm of Halliburton Roche. The building reflects the verticality of structure with its clean-lined and slender bands of terracotta extending upward 16 stories, culminating in an elaborately detailed fascia and cornice. Its facade represents a transition between the Chicago School of Architecture and the many buildings later designed by the firm of Halliburton Root. Lastly, the Century building could be seen as a precursor to the work of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe to the immediate west. This is the courthouse with its vertical curtain wall and articulation of the Dirksen Federal Courthouse, constructed some 50 years later. It's an astounding building, and if you will, a Reliance building in waiting, one of our great landmarks anchoring this important corner of State and Adams Street. There is also the clarity of the Consumers building with its magnificent vertical tower, paired window spans at the building's upper floors, and Chicago-style windows along with its commercial storefronts at its base. It really does follow the tripartite system of design that we see in Chicago, with a definite base or ground floor, shaft or middle section of the building, and top fascia sections. This is further emphasized by terracotta bands at the first, 4th, 5th, 17th, 20th, and 21st floors. This type of articulation and design is a strong and clear expression of the early Chicago skyscrapers, which are now being considered as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These two buildings are not part of that site, but represent that style, which is before the UNESCO World Heritage as a nomination. The Consumers building overall design was executed by Jenny Mundy and Jensen. It's a fine example of this system, and it's also very important to the State Street street wall and also Chicago's most important terracotta district, extending from the Chicago Theater and the Carson Perry Scott store to the Rothschild and these two buildings. The great architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe also honored these early skyscrapers and methodically placed his Chicago Federal Center building strategically and artistically to further recognize and honor these structures. We feel that it's most important to recognize that both the Century and Consumers buildings have been part of our Chicago 7 most endangered list since 2012, followed 4 times in 2013, 2022, and 2023. Landmarks Illinois, our sister statewide organization, has also named this as one of their these two buildings as one of their most endangered in Illinois, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation recently recognized these buildings as one of their 11 most endangered in the United States. So it's time to reverse this overall situation with positive reinvestment in these structures. We at Preservation Chicago have the vision of a Chicago Collaborative Archives Center, but these buildings could also be used for a variety of different purposes as well. Let's not repeat the actions of more than half a century ago with the demolition of the Chicago Stock Exchange building, the Schiller Garrick building, and the Republic building, and others. We wish to work with the GSA as our partner and all of you. And if we are truly America's city of architecture, we must do more to preserve these buildings. So we request that the buildings be considered as designated landmarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ward. Next speaker is Natalie Hicks. And I'm going to also line this up, James Perry and Adam Natanshan. Okay. And are you speaking on both buildings?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Natalie Hicks. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy for AIA Chicago. AIA Chicago supports the designation of the Century and Consumers buildings as Chicago landmarks. On behalf of our approximately 4,000 members, AIA Chicago joins with many other organizations to advocate for the preservation of the Century building, built in 1915 by Halliburton Roche at 202 South State Street, and the Consumers building, built in 1913 by Jenny Mundy and Jensen at 220 South State Street. These buildings represent significant contributions to the Chicago School of Architecture by respected firms. We stand with the communities calling for adapted reuse and revitalization of both high-rises. While security concerns for the adjacent federal complex are valid and a topic very familiar to most architects in their practice, we strongly believe that a design team will be able to address them during the revitalization process while respecting the existing urban fabric of the State Street corridor. These towers help anchor the street and provide a reminder that Chicago is the birthplace of the skyscraper. Their demolition would leave a hole in the urban fabric of State Street, which would harm pedestrian flows and the imageability of an important commercial corridor. Recent successes with adaptive reuse have run the gamut of construction complexity. We have seen local buildings realize their potential after being vacant for many years and then repurposed. These projects include the former salt shed, Chicago Athletic Association, Cook County Hospital, and the old post office, to name just a few. They demonstrate that long dormant buildings with unique challenges can yield financial and cultural rewards. Historic projects of architectural significance continue to create value more than 100 years after they were first designed and constructed. The Century and Consumer buildings were built to last, and they continue to enhance Chicago's legacy as an architecturally significant city. Preservation of our buildings is also vital to a sustainable future for all of Chicagoans. According to the 2002 Climate Action Plan of the City of Chicago, our residential, commercial, and industrial buildings account for nearly 69% of the city's carbon footprint. In these critical years where we must limit global emissions, the embodied carbon of building materials must be reduced, emphasizing again the critical value of preservation and reuse. As Chicagoans, it is our strong belief we should not ignore architectural legacy. Instead, we should harness the talents of our design community to resolve any concerns while preserving the richest of our urban fabric. AIA Chicago is ready to work with all partners in the successful and safe reuse of these two properties. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. James Perry. Mr. Perry, if you could.
Good morning.
Good morning. Are you speaking on both
For both
buildings?
buildings,
Both buildings.
So
Okay,
I'm just a citizen who overlooks those buildings and would miss them terribly. So I agree with both previous speakers that I speak in favor of preserving those buildings.
Wonderful. If you could state your name, though.
James Perry.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Adam?
Hello, my name is Adam Natanshan, Director of Operations for Preservation Chicago.
Both buildings?
Oh, I'm sorry,
For
yes,
the record?
I'm speaking on behalf of both
Okay.
buildings, please.
Thank you.
It's always an honor to address the Commission on Chicago Landmarks. Chicago's architectural heritage is among the best in the world. The invention of the skyscraper in Chicago was a major engineering milestone in the history of cities and architecture. Like the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk or Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon, these watershed moments separated time into two. The early skyscrapers were called the Chicago School and were as significant as the Wright Flyer and the Apollo 11 command module, both of which are now prized and protected for all time at the Smithsonian, D.C. But buildings cannot be moved into museums, so the United Nations UNESCO World Heritage Site designation was created to bring the museums to the buildings. The future of Chicago's UNESCO World Heritage Site is tied to the future of Century and Consumers. The architectural importance of these buildings is widely recognized and acknowledged. There has been incredible sustained coverage of the Century and Consumers preservation effort over the past 2 years. There have been over 50 press and media articles, and there have been 4 Sun-Times editorials. Last week, the Sun-Times editorial board declared their position with a profound clarity when they wrote, quote, "The Century and Consumers must be saved, renovated, and reused," end quote. This issue has grown much bigger than Chicago. It's captured the attention of an international audience. There have been nearly 24,000 signatures on Preservation Chicago's petition and 167 comments in support. The B1M video has been viewed over 1.4 million times. The world is watching. I prepared a printout of those documents for submittal today to the commission. The Court of Public Opinion is strongly opposed to the demolition of Century and Consumers. It's true that regardless of landmark status, the federal government will retain the legal power to demolish Century and Consumers. But landmark designation is an important step for the city of Chicago to send a clear message. Through this process, every argument for demolition presented has been thoroughly and categorically disproven. They argued that security requires demolition, yet the Archive Center Adaptive Reuse Plan meets or exceeds every single security requirement. But instead of enthusiastically engaging with the specifics of this creative win-win alternative, they haven't yet acknowledged that it exists. So perhaps this march towards demolition is not really about security. They argued that the Chicago School buildings were at odds with Mies van der Rohe's modernist federal center. But in fact, Century and Consumers were essential cornerstones to the master design, as confirmed by leading architectural Mies scholars and architects who worked directly with Mies van der Rohe himself. So perhaps this march towards demolition is not really about architecture. They argued that there was no funding to restore these buildings, which is why there's been almost no building maintenance during their 17-year ownership. Yet, the $52 million earmark can be reallocated to restoration, if so desired. So perhaps this march towards demolition is not really about money. There are simply no demolition arguments left that have not been disproven. Yet, the march towards demolition continues. We will continue to advocate for a preservation-sensitive outcome for Century and Consumers, and we encourage you to support the Chicago landmark designation of Century and Consumers. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Next 3 speakers, Phyllis Ellen, Kendra Parson, and Max Chavez. Phyllis.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm
And
going
if
to
you could
speak about
indicate
both
both
buildings,
buildings.
yes.
Thank you.
My name is Phyllis Ellen. I'm an historian, retired from the National Park Service, and a former member of the Landmarks Commission, on which I served for 10 years, from 2001 to 2011. I strongly support the landmark designation of both of these buildings. As contributing buildings to a district on the National Register of Historic Places, the Century and Consumer buildings should be protected from demolition. But these buildings do more than contribute to a National Register district. Their large-scale and high-quality design and workmanship play an important role in defining the historic Loop streetscape and exemplifying the history of Chicago architecture in this key period of its development. Their removal would be a loss to the character of the street and the surrounding area, which is characterized by walls of buildings, not a parkscape. Pritzker Park already exists immediately to the south, and the Federal Plaza provides more open space to the west. Adding more open space in this area would expand an anachronistic hole in the urban fabric. But more importantly, their demolition would be a significant loss to the heritage of Chicago, the nation, and indeed the world, which recognizes the architectural legacy of what has come to be known as the Chicago School as uniquely influential. The need for security at the federal courts is a serious issue that deserves serious consideration. Such consideration could well include adaptive requirements, such as filling in windows on the side of the buildings facing the Federal Center. But demolition would be a wholly unnecessary overreaction to the circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Kendra Parson. If you could indicate if you're speaking on both.
Yes, good morning. I will plan to speak to both buildings. Good morning. My name is Kendra Parson. I am the Advocacy Manager for Landmarks Illinois, the statewide organization helping people save places for people. We enthusiastically support landmark designation for both the Century and Consumers buildings at 202 and 220 South State Street. In both 2022 and 2023, Landmarks Illinois included the Century and Consumers buildings in its list of the most endangered historic places in Illinois in response to the threat of demolition by their owner, the U.S. General Services Administration, which contends that these buildings must be demolished in order to address security concerns at the nearby Dirksen U.S. Courthouse. While we do not wish to diminish the legitimate security concerns pertaining to the courthouse, it is our position that there are viable alternatives to demolition, including adaptively reusing the Century and Consumers buildings while prioritizing security through design, construction, and operations. As we've stated publicly on numerous prior occasions, demolishing the Century and Consumers buildings would be the wrong choice for Chicago. The stated intention for these lots following demolition is not to build new, but to landscape them, leaving a prominent hole in State Street, Chicago's most important downtown retail corridor. Demolition would erase the potential for these buildings to be put back into active use and once again contribute to the vibrancy and economic life of the Loop. It would also be wasteful of the energy and materials that are embodied in these buildings. So as the GSA considers these buildings for demolition, designating them as City of Chicago landmarks would send a strong statement in favor of their retention and reuse. Landmarks Illinois remains dedicated to finding a preservation solution for these buildings and anticipates that Chicago landmark designation will contribute to that hoped-for outcome, which our organization and so many others have been tirelessly advocating for. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendra. Max Chavez.
Good morning. I'll be speaking on both
Thank
at the
you.
same time. I think there was also a form submitted, there was a second form submitted on my behalf, an accident, so scrap that, okay. Good morning, everyone. This is Max Chavez, Director of Research and Special Projects at Preservation Chicago. Like seemingly most others in this room, I'm here to voice support for the landmarking of the Century and Consumers buildings. Whether it be for architectural or historical or environmental reasons, the preservation and the restoration and reuse of these two monumental structures is of the utmost importance. And it's one of the most pressing issues facing the historic built environment in the city of Chicago today. It's difficult to fathom that after all we've come to understand about the sins of urban renewal and the effects of unchecked demolition on the ongoing climate crisis, that we're today facing the loss of these two buildings. The question of their preservation is not just about saving significant early skyscrapers or important works by important architects, although those are, of course, important factors here. But what happens to the Century and Consumers buildings will surely set a precedent for the future of other American cities for years or decades to come. Much like Ward noted earlier, modern-day preservationists often point to the demolition of buildings like the Chicago Stock Exchange or the Garrick as these watershed moments in the Chicago landscape. These were buildings that we today can't understand how they were ever demolished. Their loss is so great that we sense their absence in the built environment today. And we can fully expect the Century and Consumers buildings to join the ranks of those storied buildings if we do not act and do everything in our power to protect these two buildings today. We cannot repeat the mistakes of past generations, especially with such a powerful show of support from the public and with so many viable options for reuse at hand. The eyes of so many are on Chicago and the Century and Consumers buildings, so it is for that reason, along with so many others, that we must carry out every action within our power to slow this sure-to-be-regretted mistake. We're asking that you grant these buildings landmark status, much like the many other places in Chicago that we have deemed too important to lose. While it may not be an automatic solution to the problem at hand, it will definitively signal to GSA and the federal government that as a city proud of its architectural heritage, we value and we treasure these beautiful buildings. So please help us through landmark designation, send the message that demolition is not an option here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. The next three speakers are Tara Torn Rudisell, Brian Kornpen, and Ernestine Mizzi. Hi.
Good morning.
And are you speaking in both buildings?
I will be speaking on behalf of both buildings.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Tara Torn-Rudisill. I'm a building envelope consultant with Klein & Hoffman, a Chicago-based architecture and engineering firm. However, my comments here today are my own. For the better part of the last 20 years, I've had the privilege to be the building envelope consultant on behalf of various architects of record for both the 202 and 220 South State buildings. I am one of a handful of people who has had the opportunity to observe the facades up close 100% of these buildings. You know the importance of the firms that have designed both of these buildings. They are from a period of significant development in both design and aesthetics and structural innovation. But this is also a story about the history of the construction workers who built these enduring high-rises, including the craftspeople who created the beautiful terracotta units, the massive torsade profiles on 220, the detail of the knights and the shield at 202 on the 4th floor, the sandy matte deep green finish of 202's spandrels and jambs, the intricate polychrome terracotta screen that forms 202's parapet walls, which no photo can accurately represent. These buildings share the stories of countless workers who wore smooth the marble steps in the lobbies, in buildings that once commanded some of the highest rents in the city of Chicago. Over 100 years of atmospheric pollution may have diminished the grandeur of these buildings, but the facades are salvageable. If restored, these buildings will rival Wrigley Building and other Chicago landmarks. But this is also a story about the people of today and the future. The idea that these buildings need to be removed for the protection of the federal court began many years ago from a now outdated threat assessment. Threat assessments are limited in their scope and do not necessarily address the opportunities that a site can afford. Removal of these buildings would open numerous sight lines between the court and several privately owned buildings and parking garages. Both buildings and the site can be hardened to provide safety. There are several firms that specialize in both threat assessment and protective design that can develop necessary solutions for historic significant structures such as these, including firms located here in Chicago. It is my fervent hope that limited understanding of these buildings' potential does not result in the destruction of these gorgeous buildings that are part of Chicago's development. I wholeheartedly support the landmark designation of both buildings. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Brian Korpen. And if you could indicate if you're speaking on both.
I will speak on both, yes.
Thank you.
My name is Brian Kempen. I'm a resident of Albany Park. Over the past couple years, Chicago has lost numerous terracotta buildings. It was fire that took down the smashy automotive Egyptian terracotta and the auto... it was fire that took down the smashy automotive Egyptian terracotta and the auto showroom turned furniture store on Lawrence. Progress that demolished the Logan Square Mega Mall, the Hollenbach building on Lake Street, and most recently 6740 South Shore Drive, aka the Harold and Edith Midas House. And neglect befell the Rambler building off Motor Row. Don't let purposeful neglect be the downfall of both the Consumers and Century buildings. Both buildings were occupied when the GSA eminent domained them back in 2005. The reason both structures are in the condition they are is solely the fault of the federal government and the GSA. They want to be rewarded for being slumlords, and that's not how this process should or does work. The Century and Consumers buildings are of a style and ornamentation that will never be built again. True craftsmen designed and hand-packed the terracotta. While new terracotta is still produced, it's generally of a slick, clean simple design lacking any and all filigree. If the Chicago Commission on Landmarks denies these buildings Chicago's only means of physical protection, then they will be turning their back to a combined 38 stories and 218 years of architecture. Don't let this be another woulda, coulda, shoulda lesson like the Daniel Burnham Powerhouse at Grove and Canal, torn down in 2014, or the Chicago Machinery Building, also by Daniel Burnham, and demolished in 2018, now both vacant lots. The burden of proof is on the government for why these two skyscrapers need to come down. They've made up wild hypothetical situations which they claim prove buildings need to be demolished, but with zero proof. At the same time, when there was a legitimate, proven security threat against the same courthouse building in 2004 from a truck bomb, the federal government has made zero changes to courthouse security as a result. Vehicle traffic, standing zones on Dearborn, even truck access hasn't been restricted or modified in any way after prosecution of the would-be bomber. Yet somehow, a fantasy scenario about a sniper from a neighboring building, warrants spending $52 million on demolishing both buildings. It's ludicrous. It is not premature to grant landmark designation to both of these buildings. The Chicago Commission on Landmarks has one important job to do today, and that's to make a bold statement saying, you will not tear down these buildings. Figure out another way. The process starts by granting full landmark status and cementing these two towers into the permanent living record of Chicago architectural history for future generations to use and enjoy.
Thank you. Ernestine Mizzi?
Good morning. My name is Anna Mizzi, and I'm speaking on behalf of both of the buildings. I am a fourth-generation Chicagoan, and I support the designation of landmark status of the Century and Commerce buildings. I love the city, and I hope that Chicago uses the unique opportunity it currently has to designate landmark status, thus granting protection from demolishing and further decay of the Century and Commerce buildings. They are gorgeous. They're intricately designed, which speaks to the historic majesty of Chicago. Buildings like these are no longer constructed and cannot be made as the materials and skill involved are things of the past. These buildings can be repaired, and landmark designation would influence the GSA to stop the buildings from further disrepair. The last GSA meeting I attended suggested that demolishing the buildings would negatively impact the historic appeal of the downtown corridor. I feel like landmark status is necessary to further protect the aesthetic of the Loop. I am a resident of Printers Row, and this is part of my neighborhood. I moved here because I looked up in wonder at the buildings that gave me the feeling of being in Chicago 100 years ago. I hope the fifth generation of my family and beyond are able to share the same sense of pride I have in the history and beauty of this city.
Thank you. Last two speakers are Mary Lou Seidel and Dirk Lohan. Mary Lou? And if you could indicate if you're speaking on behalf of both buildings. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Mary Lou Seidel. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for Preservation Chicago, and I am speaking in support of both buildings. I just want to reiterate what everybody else said. I won't repeat all those details, but this building, like so many others, meets these criteria above and beyond, and this should have been landmarked a long time ago, so we are glad it's happening now, and we fully support this designation. When I worked on State Street one Sunday and turned new people onto this building, they were just thrilled by it and thrilled by the chance of it being landmarked. And I hope that, we're really hopeful that the GSA respects the decision of the city in landmarking these buildings, and it helps convince them to turn around their decision to demolish. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Lou. Dirk, you're on. And if you could indicate if you're speaking on behalf of both buildings, please.
Indicate what?
If you're speaking on behalf of both buildings.
My name is Dirk Lohan. I'm a general practitioner architect in Chicago for most of my life. I actually came to Chicago from Europe to joined my grandfather, Mies van der Rohe, in practicing architecture, learning architecture at IIT. And would you believe it, the first job I ever had was doing the wood paneling in the courtrooms of the Dirksen Federal Building. And I feel motivated and moved to advocate the preservation of these two wonderful old buildings that are now roughly a little more than 100 years old. And it is interesting to see this picture that you, I think, published, or whoever did, gives a wonderful rendering of the two tall buildings on State Street that we're discussing today and that I'm supporting to be landmarked and preserved, with the background of the Dirksen Federal Building, and you can see a real kinship there between the architecture of these buildings. Mies learned from Chicago too. When he came in 1938 for the first time to this city, he then became the director of architecture at IIT, and he was given a tour of the city, would you believe it, by Bertrand Goldberg, and Bertrand showed him these buildings on State Street and, of course, the Reliance Building, which everybody here knows. All the features and reasons why these buildings should be preserved has been said already, and I will not restate them, but I want to urge you with deep conviction that there are solutions to the problem of the security that, by the way, I have never heard yet in all these discussions, a real discussion about how to solve that security problem, if that is the problem. Because I'd be very happy to contribute to this discussion and to this work if that has to be done. I also did a study of the relationship of the federal buildings to the adjoining streets and buildings, and there is not one foot that these two buildings are closer to the federal building than other buildings, the Monadnock building to the Kluzinski building, or other buildings on Adams and to the Dirksen building across the street. In other words, Mies, in the master planning of the complex, kept a distance to the existing architecture the way it would make sense, which is about 75 feet. And we had recently a very first charrette organized by the GSA, what could be done with this half a block on State Street to the east of the Dirksen building, and I think some very good ideas emerged. Obviously too premature to be shown or to be discussed, but I want to indicate to you that I am convinced a good solution can be created here for the long-term benefit of Chicago's urban environment. And so I'm supporting both buildings for the landmark status.
Thank you, Dirk. Appreciate it. All right. That concludes the statements in favor of the designation. There don't appear to be any statements in opposition to the designation. So this concludes the portion of the designation hearing for the Century Building. The portion of the hearing relating to the Consumer Building at 220 South State Street. Let's see. If we could begin with a chronology of events leading to the public hearing and incorporate the Commission's exhibits into the record. I believe the chronology previously read for the Century Building portion of this hearing accurately and completely reflects the same chronology for the consumer buildings, and that the Commission documents already submitted include all of those relevant for the consumers as well as the Century Building. Deanna, if you could please confirm that.
The same chronology and documents apply to the Consumers Building.
Thank you. In the interest of avoiding repetition, I'd like to, for the chronology and commission documents to be made part of the record for the consumer building. The commission's documents may be examined at this hearing and are also available for inspection at the commission's office. There doesn't appear to be anybody requesting party status for the consumers building. And if everybody has signed up to speak, well, pretty much everybody signed up to speak on both the consumers and the Century Building. So we don't have any more there. Presentation, Matt, if you want to do the presentation, then we'll continue on.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Wong. The Consumers Building was built between 1911 and 1913. It was designed by architects Mundy and Jensen. It's located on the west side of State Street on the block between Adams and Jackson at 220 South State. At the time of its construction, Quincy Street, seen here from above, with the Consumers Building on the right, was a through street, and both the south and east elevations of the building would have been street facing. In 1960, the City Council passed an ordinance to vacate the western half of Quincy for the construction of the new federal courts building, stretching from Adams to Jackson. The eastern half of Quincy became a pedestrian plaza. In 2017, a barrier was put up to prevent access to this plaza. The Commission has preliminarily found that the Consumers Building meets 3 criteria for landmark designation, including 1 for heritage. The building was a speculative commercial building built in response to the rising value of real estate along State Street around the turn of the 20th century. Shown framed in red dashes are views to the west, north, and northeast of the lower scale structures which would have been taken down to make way for the Consumers Building. Developer Jacob Kessner commissioned the Consumers Building as a professional office building. Professional office and tall shops building began to increase in number after the turn of the 20th century and typically were located at corners with smaller footprints than department stores. Maximum advantage was taken of valuable State Street frontage, so floors had large storefront windows. Stairs also typically led to basement spaces utilized for commercial purposes. Floors just above the ground floor included large expanses of glass for display or signage, and often stairs located in the lobby provided easy access to these upper floors. These floors were open and could be subdivided to provide maximum flexibility so that tenants of all sizes could find space in the building. As a professional office building, the Consumers was intended to appeal to a mix of tenant types, emphasizing the flexibility of its floor plans and the features with universal appeal, namely windows at all elevations, excellent elevators, and janitorial services, and a great location. A basement restaurant, such as the Winter Garden, whose ad is seen at right, was one of the commercial amenities established for those working in the building. Tenant spaces with natural light and vent from windows were at a premium, so the developer, Mr. Kesner, purchased the property directly to the north to ensure that no building would encroach on the Consumers' north elevation. Then, by centralizing the elevator core, fenestration was possible at all elevations of this building. The State and Quincy building was rechristened as the Consumers Building in 1913. It was named for the coal and ice delivery company which occupied the upper floors. The photo at right shows large-scale sign installed atop the building with the Consumers Company name. The Consumers Building is a prime example of a professional office building, a distinct building type important to the evolution of State Street, reflecting the symbiotic relationship between retail and professional services seen throughout the street's history as Chicago's primary retail thoroughfare. Lower floor retail tenants generated foot traffic, which brought recognition and potential customers to the location. Restaurants and other shops were conveniently located in the building for workers on its upper floors, and the higher rents which retail tenants paid allowed for better quality shared building services. In return, upper floor tenants provided a greater pool of likely customers for the restaurants in the building. A series of those restaurants were established in the basement tenant space of the building, especially during its early history. The building's ground and second floor tenants in the 1920s through the 1940s were jewelers, men's and women's clothing stores, and cigar shops. The largest corner retail space was leased to New York City-based Howard Clothes as their first branch store in the Midwest from 1936 until the store closed in the 1970s. Upper floors contained a wide variety of tenants, including service providers like barbers, tailors, furriers, retailers of items like carpets and typewriters, manufacturers, agents, insurance companies, and other small entrepreneurs, as well as even some schools and nonprofit organizations. The Landmarks Commission also preliminarily found that Consumers Building meets criterion 4 for exemplary architecture. The Consumers Building is a commercial style building in the tradition of the Chicago School of Architecture. Its steel frame is expressed on the exterior by the more solid grid-like patterns of continuous narrow vertical piers and narrow horizontal spandrel bands. The overall height of the structure relative to its width, plus the widening of piers at the corners and the center of the east elevation, emphasize the vertical over the horizontal elements of the facade. Like the Century Building I discussed earlier, the Consumers was one of dozens of loop structures built in the 2 decades leading up to World War I, featuring white glazed terracotta. The Consumers displays a high level of detailing and craftsmanship in classical revival style terracotta ornamentation. On the interior, the vestibule and lobby are especially noteworthy as rare surviving examples of early 20th century professional office building entry spaces. The walls and ceilings are clad in white marble with simple geometric classical revival detailing, and a marble staircase is set into an alcove. Cross beams in the vestibule and lobby align with pilasters along the walls. Decorative bronze elements include door frames, lobby fixtures like baseboard grills, a building directory, a bronze mailbox, bronze elevator detailing, and sconces. The Landmarks Commission also preliminarily found that the building is significant for its architects. It was designed by the firm of Mundy and Jensen. William Mundy and Elmer Jensen were former partners of William LeBaron Jenney, a leader in the Chicago School of Architecture. William Mundy served as architect for the Chicago Board of Education from 1898 to 1904, and he became a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. Elmer Jensen's sense of responsibility to the larger profession of architecture earned him the title Dean of Chicago Architects, and the Chicago Tribune noted that he was given about every honor members of his profession in Chicago have been able to bestow upon him. Mundy and Jensen were among a handful of important designers enlisted by auto dealers for construction of new showrooms in the automobile sales and service nexus of Motor Row, located south of the Loop. 6 of these are extant and located within the Chicago Landmark Motor Row district. The Consumers Building was one of many loop structures designed by Mundy and Jensen, including the Municipal Courts Building at 116 South Michigan Avenue, located in the Chicago Landmark Historic Michigan Avenue District, the Kesner Building at 5 North Wabash, the Lemoyne Building at 190 North Wabash, the Singer Building at 120 South State Street, and the Union League Club at 65 West Jackson. During their nearly 3 decades long partnership, Mundy and Jensen were one of the most prolific architectural firms in the city. They are known not only for their loop skyscrapers, but for their industrial, bank, and residential buildings. An industrial building is the Clemenston Company Manufacturing Building at Division and Homan, and the Chicago Landmark Westtown State Bank Building. In addition to those landmark criteria, the Commission has found that the building meets the separate integrity criterion. There have been no major additions or alterations, so the building maintains its overall historic form and appearance, including window and entrance locations. The missing cornice, replacement of storefronts are not unusual for buildings of this age and type. The exterior retains the majority of its architectural terracotta cladding and decoration and imparts a strong sense of its original visual character, though it is in need of significant repair and probably some degree of replacement terracotta. The main entrance vestibule and the elevator lobby retain an unusually high level of integrity and are rare surviving elements of a building of this type. Landmarks Commission has preliminarily found that the significant historic and architectural features are all exterior elevations, including roof lines of the building and the main entrance vestibule and elevator lobby, the lobby staircase to the 2nd floor, and the barrel vaulted staircase to the basement, including marble finishes at the walls and ceiling. In light of the Consumers Building adjacency to the Dirksen U.S. Courthouse and the security vulnerabilities asserted by the federal government, and in order to recognize and provide the flexibility which may be needed to accommodate the 15 reuse criteria provided by the GSA for this building, which were developed in collaboration with the U.S. District Court and federal law enforcement agencies and published in the Federal Register, the following additional guidelines shall also apply to the Commission's review of permits. The Commission shall have flexibility to allow modifications to the Consumers Building to accommodate the GSA's reuse criteria in order that viable reuse of this building can be achieved. The building is in the 34th Ward, and Alderman William Conway is aware of the preliminary landmark recommendation and today's hearing. And that concludes staff's presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Matt. We're doing questions for the commission staff by the property owner or other parties. Nobody signed up to be another party. I do want to indicate that the letter from the GSA, the owner of the property, dated October 23rd to the City of Chicago Department of Planning and Development, does also apply to this item. Because there are no parties that have signed up, we will move on to statements by property owners and members of the general public. Everybody has signed up and has spoken, unless there is somebody that wants to speak specifically. Ward.
I just wanted to mention that there was this.
Got to go on record.
Yes, thank you. Yes, hello, Mr. Chairman, Ward Miller, Richard H. Treehouse, Executive Director of Preservation Chicago. Wanted to mention that Kevin Harrington, the noted historian on Mies van der Rohe, his work, and also on the early Chicago school buildings, regretfully could not be here this morning because of an illness. I submitted a statement on his behalf to for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Ward. Appreciate that. Okay. Nobody has signed up in opposition to the designation. This concludes today's public hearing. The commission will consider the entire record, including the transcript of today's hearings, at the December 7th, 2023 regular meeting of the Commission on Chicago Landmarks, and determine whether to make final recommendations to City Council on the proposed landmark designation of the Century and Consumers buildings. The meeting is open to the public, and details for participation are available on the Commission website at chicago.gov/CCL. Thank you all for being here today. We appreciate it. And we're here.